What if the most explosive moment in a royal marriage didn't happen in public, but in private, behind closed doors, late at night, when there were no cameras, no handlers, and no carefully rehearsed smiles? Because according to multiple conflicting accounts, that is exactly where this story begins. Not with a press release, not with a public appearance, but with a conversation so raw, so emotionally charged, that people close to the situation say it fractured everything that came after. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. One sentence, one decision, and one realization that the marriage, as the world knew it, was already over. Here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. What happens when a relationship built on defiance, sacrifice, and spectacle finally runs out of oxygen? For years, the public narrative surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle has been tightly controlled, fiercely defended, and emotionally charged. Supporters see a couple fighting against an unforgiving institution. Critics see a marriage fueled by conflict rather than stability. And somewhere between those extremes sits a quieter truth that rarely makes headlines. A truth about exhaustion, about resentment, about what happens when love turns into a battlefield instead of a refuge. Insiders describe the last stretch of this marriage not as dramatic shouting matches, but something far more unsettling. Long silences, emotional withdrawal, and conversations that felt less like arguments and more like negotiations. Negotiations over control, over narrative, over who is willing to give up more. And then, according to those accounts, came the moment that changed everything. A private discussion where Prince Harry made it clear that the marriage could not continue in its current form. Not a threat, not an ultimatum shouted in anger, but a cold, deliberate admission that stunned the room. People familiar with that night say Meghan didn't respond the way anyone expected. No dramatic exit. No immediate retaliation. Instead, an emotional reaction so intense that those present later described it as a breaking point, the moment when fear replaced confidence and desperation replaced control. And this is where the story becomes complicated, because what followed was not a clean break or a mutual understanding. It was a series of emotional standoffs, private appeals, and behind-the-scenes interventions that have never been fully explained to the public. Why? Because acknowledging them would mean admitting that the marriage wasn't collapsing because of the press, but because of something far more personal. Ask yourself this: if everything was truly fine behind the scenes, why did the tone shift so dramatically afterward? Why did public appearances grow colder? Why did body language experts suddenly notice physical distance where unity once dominated? Why did people close to Harry begin quietly re-entering his life? People who had been absent for years. And perhaps most telling of all, why did palace insiders reportedly begin preparing for outcomes they had once considered unthinkable? To understand why this story matters now, you have to look at timing. This wasn't a random emotional explosion. It happened at a moment when pressure was already mounting from every direction. Legal disputes, financial strain, media fatigue, public credibility battles. Every marriage feels pressure, but this one was never allowed to crack quietly. And that's the irony no one talks about. The very independence Harry fought for may have left him emotionally isolated. Meanwhile, Meghan, who once appeared in full command of the narrative, was suddenly facing the possibility of losing not just a marriage, but the role, leverage, and identity she had built around it. According to sources who claim knowledge of the situation, the conversation that night included words that neither of them could take back. Harry, they say, spoke about wanting a different future, a calmer one, a less adversarial one, a life no longer defined by constant resistance. And that's when a name from his past reportedly resurfaced, not as a plan, not as a confirmed future, but as a symbol of something Harry felt he had lost: normalcy, history, a version of himself untouched by years of public warfare. Now, let's be very clear. There is no verified confirmation of romantic intentions at that moment. But emotionally, the damage was already done. Because once the idea was spoken aloud, once Meghan realized that Harry's heart was no longer fully anchored, the dynamic shifted permanently. What followed, according to multiple narratives, was a deeply emotional period marked by intense private conversations, tearful appeals, and moments where the line between love and fear blurred dangerously thin. This wasn't about manipulation in the cartoonish sense. It was about survival. About what happens when someone realizes they may lose everything they've been fighting to protect. Public image, influence, security, and perhaps most painfully, relevance. People close to Meghan describe this period as one of emotional volatility. Not performative, not strategic, but deeply human. Moments of resolve followed by moments of collapse. Strength followed by panic. Confidence followed by disbelief. And Harry? Those same sources describe him as eerily calm, detached, already mourning the relationship even while standing inside it. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. What hurts more, being betrayed or realizing someone has emotionally left you long before they physically do? Because according to insiders, Harry had been pulling away for months. Small signs at first. Shorter conversations. Avoidance of conflict rather than engagement. A shift from we to I. When confronted, he reportedly didn't deny it. He explained it. And that explanation may have been more devastating than anger ever could be. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to escape a life that felt like constant war. That realization, people say, is what triggered Meghan's most intense reaction, not rage, but fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of erasure, fear that the story she had helped create was slipping out of her control. And here's where the public narrative fractures. Because while some portray Meghan as calculating, others insist she was genuinely blindsided, convinced that loyalty and sacrifice had earned permanence. And in that emotional chaos, boundaries blurred. Private conversations became emotionally charged standoffs. Appeals turned into ultimatums. And advisors on both sides reportedly began stepping in, not to save the marriage, but to contain the fallout. Containment is a word that keeps appearing in these accounts. Containment of emotions, containment of leaks, containment of reputational damage. Because once a royal separation crosses a certain line, there's no undoing it. And that line, according to insiders, was crossed that night. But the public still doesn't know what was said next, only that after this moment, nothing between Harry and Meghan looked the same again. And the most unsettling part, the world would not hear about it for months. Smiles continued, statements were issued, appearances were managed. But privately, the marriage was already in freefall. And the question everyone would soon be forced to ask was no longer, are they struggling? It was this: how far will someone go when they feel they're about to lose everything? Because what came next wasn't just a separation of hearts. It was a battle for narrative, sympathy, and survival. And the first move in that battle had already been made. But what happened immediately after that conversation, the decisions, the reactions, the people who got involved, would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What if the real breaking point in this marriage wasn't loud, but quiet? What if it wasn't a fight, a scandal, or a leak, but a realization that arrived slowly, painfully, and without drama? Because according to people close to the situation, the hours after that late-night conversation were not explosive. They were unsettling, too calm, too still. The kind of calm that doesn't signal peace, but finality. Harry didn't storm out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue threats. Instead, he did something far more frightening to the person sitting across from him. He stopped negotiating. And that's when Meghan understood something she hadn't allowed herself to believe before. This wasn't another phase. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't the press getting to him. This was resolve. People familiar with the situation describe the immediate aftermath as emotionally disorienting. Meghan, they say, kept trying to rewind the conversation, revisiting earlier moments, reframing his words, insisting that what he was feeling was temporary. Shock does that to people. It convinces them that if they just explain harder, love will snap back into place. But Harry didn't move. He listened, he nodded, and then he repeated himself. Calmly, deliberately. The marriage, as it existed, could not continue. That repetition, the lack of anger, the lack of drama, is what insiders say rattled Meghan the most. Because anger can be fought, silence can be filled. But certainty? Certainty leaves no room to maneuver. And here's where the public narrative gets it wrong. This wasn't a moment where one person won and the other lost. This was a moment where two people realized they were no longer fighting the same battle. Harry wasn't trying to punish. He was trying to exit. And that distinction matters. Because once someone decides they want out, not to teach a lesson, not to force change, but to survive, the power dynamic shifts instantly. Meghan, according to those close to her, felt that shift immediately. She began asking questions that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with fear. Are you serious? Is this really happening? Have you already decided? Notice the pattern. Not why, not how, but how far along are you without me? That's the moment denial starts to crack. And in that crack, something else rushes in. Panic. Because panic doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like over-reasoning, over-explaining, rewriting history in real time. Sources say Meghan began listing sacrifices she had made, moves, losses, public attacks she endured, opportunities she gave up, not as guilt, but as proof that the marriage deserved saving, that she deserved loyalty, that this ending didn't make sense. And Harry didn't deny those sacrifices. That's another detail insiders emphasize. He acknowledged them, he respected them, but he didn't change his position, which only made the situation worse. Because when someone refuses to argue, it often means they've already grieved the relationship privately. And that realization is devastating. Ask yourself this: what's more painful, hearing someone say they're angry with you or hearing them say they're done trying? Meghan reportedly oscillated between disbelief and determination. At one point, she tried to turn the conversation forward. What would this look like? How would it be framed? Who would control the narrative? Those questions weren't cold or calculating, they were instinctive. When your life has been lived under scrutiny, narrative becomes safety. But Harry wasn't interested in narrative. He was interested in quiet. And that may have been the biggest incompatibility of all. According to insiders, he spoke about wanting a future that didn't feel like constant defense. No press wars, no perpetual outrage, no sense that every decision required justification. He wanted normal arguments, normal privacy, normal mistakes. And to Meghan, that sounded dangerously close to erasure, because their public identity had become inseparable from their bond. If the marriage ended, what happened to the story? What happened to the meaning? What happened to everything they had fought so hard to build? This is where contradictions start piling up. Harry, who once sacrificed family for love, now wanted distance from conflict. Meghan, who once thrived on visibility, now feared being left behind by it. Neither was wrong, but they were no longer aligned. People close to the couple say the hours that followed were emotionally exhausting. No sleep, no resolution, just circles. And then something subtle but significant happened. Harry began setting boundaries. He asked for space, not metaphorical space, actual, physical, emotional distance. That request, simple on the surface, landed like a shockwave. Because space means separation, and separation means acknowledgement. From that point on, the tone changed. Messages became shorter, conversations became scheduled, affection became cautious, and for the first time, Meghan was no longer leading the emotional rhythm of the relationship. That loss of rhythm can be terrifying, especially when your sense of stability has been tied to connection. Sources say Meghan reacted by intensifying communication, more talking, more explaining, more urgency, not out of manipulation, but fear. Fear that silence meant abandonment. And Harry? He grew quieter, more contained, less reactive. A classic emotional divergence. One person reaching, the other retreating. And when that happens, the distance grows faster than either person expects. Here's something else that rarely gets discussed. Harry wasn't just leaving a marriage. He was leaving a version of himself. The warrior, the defiant prince, the symbol of rebellion. That identity had carried him for years. But identities can become cages. And according to people close to him, he had begun to feel trapped by the very role that once empowered him. This internal conflict didn't start overnight. Friends say he had been expressing doubts for months. Not about love, but about sustainability. Could he live forever in reaction mode? Could he raise children under constant tension? Could he ever rest? Those doubts quietly eroded the foundation of the marriage long before that late-night conversation. Meghan, however, believed the external pressure was temporary. That once lawsuits ended, once public perception shifted, once they regained control, everything would stabilize. That belief kept her fighting. But Harry had stopped fighting the outside world. And once that happened, the inside world collapsed. Advisors on both sides reportedly became aware of the shift quickly. Not because of leaks, but because of behavior. Canceled meetings, changed schedules, separate consultations. When advisors start preparing individually instead of jointly, it's a sign that unity is no longer assumed. This is where the containment strategy began. Not a separation announcement, not a legal filing, but quiet damage control. What happens if this goes public? Who speaks first? How do we prevent emotional decisions from becoming permanent headlines? Because once the story escapes, you don't control it anymore. And the irony? The silence meant to protect them only intensified speculation. Public appearances grew strained, smiles didn't reach eyes, body language shifted. People noticed. They always do. And Meghan noticed that people noticed, which only heightened the pressure. According to insiders, she began urging Harry to reconsider timing. Not the decision, the timing. Wait, pause, breathe, let things calm down. But Harry had already reached a dangerous emotional state, acceptance. And acceptance is often mistaken for coldness, but it's actually grief completed. He had already mourned the future he was letting go of. Meghan hadn't, and that imbalance made every interaction feel unstable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When one person is still fighting for the relationship and the other is preparing for life after it, the relationship is already over, even if no one has said the words out loud. By the end of that first day, insiders say Meghan understood something fundamental had changed. Harry wasn't asking for reassurance. He wasn't seeking compromise. He was preparing to disengage. And that realization triggered a new phase. Not denial, not negotiation, but escalation. Because when someone feels they're about to lose everything, they don't retreat. They fight. And the way that fight would unfold, emotionally, strategically, and publicly, would shock everyone involved. But the most surprising twist? The next move didn't come from Meghan, it came from someone Harry hadn't spoken to in years. And that contact would quietly change the direction of everything that followed. What if the next turning point didn't come from inside the marriage at all? What if it came from a voice Harry hadn't heard in years? A voice that carried memories from a life he thought he'd permanently closed? Because that's what insiders say happened next. Not a confrontation, not a legal move. A call, quiet, unexpected, and emotionally destabilizing in ways no one anticipated. Here's the thing about unresolved history. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when it resurfaces, it rarely asks permission. According to people familiar with the sequence of events, Harry didn't plan to reach out, at least not consciously. The call wasn't part of a strategy. It wasn't an escape route. It wasn't even framed as romantic. It was framed as familiar. And familiarity, when you're emotionally exhausted, can feel like oxygen. The timing matters. This call didn't happen weeks later, when emotions had cooled. It didn't happen after advisors weighed in. It happened in the fragile window immediately after Harry set boundaries, when the marriage was still intact on paper, but emotionally fractured beyond repair. In other words, it happened when Harry was most vulnerable. People close to him say the decision to reach out was impulsive but telling. He wasn't looking for advice about divorce. He wasn't seeking validation. He wasn't even asking for comfort. He was reaching for a version of himself that existed before everything became complicated. Before duty turned into defiance. Before love became strategy. Before every emotion was filtered through public consequence. The conversation, according to those who claim knowledge of it, was brief at first. Polite, cautious, almost awkward. Two people testing the emotional water without acknowledging why they were there. They talked about ordinary things. Life, time passing. How strange it was that years had slipped by unnoticed. And that's what made it dangerous. Because ordinary felt extraordinary. Harry hadn't felt ordinary in a long time. Ask yourself this. When was the last time he was allowed to exist without representing something? Without symbolizing rebellion? Without being the face of a movement? Without carrying expectations he never asked for? This call offered that illusion, if only for a moment. And once the door cracked open, memory rushed in. Shared jokes, old references, moments from a life that felt simpler, even if it wasn't perfect. Not because the past was better, but because it wasn't under a microscope. People close to Meghan sensed the shift almost immediately, not because Harry confessed, but because his energy changed. He became quieter in a different way, less defensive, less reactive, more inward. That kind of change doesn't happen without cause. Meghan noticed it too. She noticed the pause before he answered questions, the way he seemed emotionally elsewhere, the fact that when she escalated, he didn't follow. That's when suspicion enters, and suspicion, once activated, changes everything. According to insiders, Meghan began pressing harder, Not aggressively, but insistently. She wanted clarity. What are you thinking? Where is this going? Are you still in this? Those questions weren't unreasonable. But Harry didn't have answers that would reassure her, because he didn't know what he was feeling yet. He only knew what he wasn't. He wasn't anchored. He wasn't settled. And he wasn't willing to pretend otherwise. This is where contradictions start to collide. Harry insisted there was no plan, no agenda, no betrayal. And that may have been true. But emotionally, the door had already opened. And once that happens, you don't get to decide what walks through. Meghan, according to people close to her, felt blindsided, not by infidelity, but by displacement. She wasn't being replaced physically, she was being replaced emotionally, by memory, by nostalgia, by a version of Harry she could no longer access. That realization stings in a way betrayal sometimes doesn't. Because you can't compete with the past. You can't argue with someone's memory of who they used to be. And the more Meghan pushed for certainty, the more Harry retreated into ambiguity. He wasn't lying. He just wasn't committing. That limbo is brutal. And it set the stage for the most emotionally volatile phase yet. According to multiple accounts, Meghan confronted Harry about the change directly, not accusing him of cheating, accusing him of leaving emotionally first, physically later. She wanted him to deny it, to reassure her, to say the call meant nothing. And Harry didn't. He didn't confirm anything either. He just didn't deny the significance. That silence landed harder than any confession could have, because it suggested that even Harry didn't fully trust his own emotional boundaries anymore. This is where advisors stepped in more aggressively. Not to stop the call, not to control feelings, but to slow the pace. Because once emotional entanglements begin overlapping with legal realities, everything becomes dangerous. Reputations, custody, assets, public narrative, all of it becomes combustible. Sources say Harry was advised to pause all external communication, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was destabilizing. And for a brief moment, he did. He pulled back, focused on logistics, focused on breathing room, focused on not making things worse. But the emotional shift couldn't be reversed. Meghan felt it, Harry felt it, and the silence between them grew heavier. According to people close to Meghan, this was the moment fear turned into urgency. Not strategic urgency, emotional urgency. She wasn't trying to win an argument, she was trying to prevent erasure, to keep the marriage from slipping into irrelevance before it even officially ended. And that urgency began manifesting in ways that worried people around her. Not theatrically, but intensely. Long conversations, emotional appeals, moments of vulnerability followed by resolve. She reminded Harry of everything they had survived, every attack, every sacrifice, every stand they took together. And Harry listened, but listening isn't the same as returning. That distinction broke something. Because for Meghan, the marriage wasn't just love, it was identity. It was purpose. It was proof that everything she endured meant something. And losing that meant more than heartbreak. It meant starting over without the shield she'd built her life around. According to insiders, she asked a question that stopped Harry cold. If I wasn't enough to keep you here, what was? Harry didn't answer. Not because he didn't care, but because the answer scared him too. Because the truth was messy. It wasn't another woman. It wasn't boredom. It wasn't resentment. It was exhaustion. And exhaustion doesn't argue. It just shuts down. The days that followed were emotionally chaotic. Some moments felt hopeful. Others felt final. Plans were discussed and abandoned. Words were spoken and walked back. And through it all, the shadow of that call lingered. Not because of what was said, but because of what it represented. Choice. The possibility of a different life. And once someone sees that possibility, you can't unsee it. Here's the twist no one expected. The next escalation didn't come from Meghan confronting Harry again. It came from someone else noticing the fracture. Someone whose job was to protect not emotions, but outcomes. A senior advisor. And when that advisor realized the emotional situation was slipping beyond containment, they made a move that would force everything into the open. A move that neither Harry nor Meghan were prepared for. Because once third parties step in, private pain becomes public strategy. And the marriage, which had been unraveling quietly, was about to enter a far more dangerous phase, one where control would matter more than love, and where silence would no longer be an option, because the next conversation wouldn't be emotional. It would be tactical, and it would change the rules entirely. What happens when emotion stops being the problem and management becomes the priority? Because that's the exact moment this story crossed a line it could never uncross. The advisor didn't raise their voice. They didn't accuse. They didn't moralize. They asked one question. A question so simple, so procedural, that it instantly reframed everything. What is the plan if this becomes public? That question landed like a cold splash of water. Up until now, everything had been emotional, raw, reactive, unstructured. But that question forced a reckoning, because it assumed something no one had said out loud yet, that this wasn't a rough patch, it was a collapse in progress. According to people familiar with the meeting, Harry didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor. He rubbed his hands together. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Meghan, on the other hand, reacted instantly. Public? What do you mean, public? That response alone revealed the growing disconnect. Harry had already crossed the mental threshold. Meghan was still trying to keep the door closed. The advisor explained calmly that the situation had reached a point where silence was no longer neutral. Silence was a choice, and choices have consequences. Leaks don't wait for permission. Rumors don't respect boundaries. And narratives form whether you participate or not. The question wasn't if this would become public, it was how, and who would control the framing. This is where the story takes a sharp turn, because from this moment on, love stopped being the main driver. Risk did. The advisor laid out scenarios, some optimistic, some catastrophic, an amicable separation narrative, a prolonged period of working through things, a sudden announcement triggered by an external leak. Each scenario came with reputational implications, financial considerations, and long-term fallout. This wasn't cruelty. This was realism, and it forced both Harry and Meghan to confront something deeply uncomfortable. They weren't just a couple anymore. They were a brand in crisis. Harry listened quietly. Meghan bristled. Not because the advisor was wrong, but because acknowledging the brand meant acknowledging the possible end of the marriage as a public entity. And once that happens, the relationship stops belonging solely to the people inside it. It becomes something others manage. Meghan pushed back. Hard. She argued that the situation was being exaggerated, that emotional moments didn't equal final decisions, that premature strategizing would harden positions that were still fluid. She wasn't wrong either, but Harry didn't support that argument. Not openly, he just didn't reinforce it. And in that silence, the advisor saw the truth. Harry was already planning his exit emotionally, which meant any delay only increased risk. The advisor shifted tone, not confrontational, protective. They spoke directly to Harry now. Are you willing to say unequivocally that you want to work toward reconciliation? It wasn't a trap. It was a checkpoint. And Harry couldn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He said something far more telling. I don't know if I can go back to what it was. That sentence changed everything. Because I don't know isn't uncertainty. It's transition. And once you're in transition, containment becomes urgent. Meghan heard it too. She heard the finality hiding inside the ambiguity. And for the first time since this began, she stopped arguing, stopped persuading, stopped negotiating. Instead, she asked a different question. If this goes public, what happens to me? That wasn't selfish. It was survival. Because for Meghan, the stakes weren't just emotional. They were existential. Public identity, professional leverage, credibility. Everything she had built since joining this world was tied to this partnership. The advisor didn't sugarcoat it. They explained that public sympathy is rarely static. It shifts based on timing, tone, and perceived power dynamics. Who speaks first matters. Who appears calm matters. Who seems blindsided matters. And suddenly, the room felt smaller. Because now, they weren't discussing feelings, they were discussing optics. Harry found this deeply uncomfortable. He had never wanted to become strategic about his own marriage ending. That was the whole point of wanting out, to stop managing, to stop performing. But once third parties step in, you don't get that luxury. The advisor recommended space, formalized space, separate schedules, limited contact, no emotional escalation. Not to end things, to stabilize them. And here's the contradiction. Space was exactly what Harry wanted, but hearing it framed as, she went very still. People close to her say that's when she becomes most dangerous to herself emotionally, when she stops expressing and starts calculating. Not calculating in a malicious way, calculating in a protective way. What do I need to do to survive this? The advisor noticed it too, which is why they added one more recommendation. No unilateral moves, no statements, no calls, no emotional decisions that could be interpreted publicly. Everything coordinated, everything controlled. That sentence may as well have been gasoline, because to Meghan, coordination felt like surrender. It meant accepting that the situation had already slipped beyond her influence, and that realization hurt more than the prospect of divorce itself. Harry agreed to the space, reluctantly. He didn't frame it as separation, he framed it as breathing room. But words don't matter when behavior shifts, and the shift was immediate. They began sleeping separately, not dramatically, logistically. Different rooms, different routines. They spoke less, not because they were avoiding each other, because there was nothing left to say without making things worse. Meghan filled the silence with activity. Calls, planning, checking. Harry filled it with withdrawal, walking, reading, avoidance. Two very different coping mechanisms colliding in the same space. This is where the emotional imbalance deepened. Meghan was still actively inside the relationship. Harry had stepped outside it mentally. And that difference creates desperation on one side and distance on the other, a dangerous combination. According to insiders, Meghan tried one last emotional appeal during this phase. Not an argument, not a plea, a moment of vulnerability. She asked Harry if he still loved her. He didn't answer immediately. And that pause did more damage than any harsh word could have, because it suggested that love wasn't the question anymore. Compatibility was, sustainability was, future viability was. Harry eventually said he cared deeply, that he always would. But he didn't say the word she was listening for, and once it wasn't said, it couldn't be unheard. After that, things moved quickly. Advisors on both sides began coordinating separately. Legal consultations were scheduled, not filings, consultations, but the act alone changes psychology. Once you talk to lawyers, you stop fantasizing about repair. You start planning for outcomes. Meghan knew this, and it terrified her, because it meant the emotional battlefield was being replaced by an administrative one. And administrators don't respond to tears, they respond to leverage. This is where strategy overtook sentiment. Meghan began thinking in terms of positioning, not revenge. Positioning. How would she be perceived if this ended? What narrative would dominate? Who would the public sympathize with? Harry, on the other hand, wanted no narrative at all. He wanted silence, privacy, a quiet disentanglement. And those two desires were fundamentally incompatible. Silence benefits the one who wants to disappear. Narrative benefits the one who must remain visible. That difference would soon explode into conflict, because Meghan began pushing back against the advisor's insistence on restraint. She argued that waiting allowed others to define the story, that passivity looked like guilt, that ambiguity invited speculation. She wanted clarity, a statement, a direction. Harry refused. He said he wasn't ready, that he needed time, that making anything public would only inflame the situation. And here's the painful truth. Both were right, but being right didn't help. It only made compromise impossible. The advisor warned them both. If you don't shape the narrative, someone else will. And almost immediately, that warning proved prophetic. Because within days, subtle signals began appearing, whispers in media circles, unusual inquiries, questions that suggested someone knew something. No full leak yet, just pressure, the kind that tests resolve. Meghan panicked, not outwardly, internally, because pressure means countdown, and countdowns demand action. Harry felt it too, but his response was different. He retreated further, stopped engaging, stopped reacting. which only intensified Meghan's fear that she was losing control of the situation entirely. This is where the final emotional rupture began. Because when one person feels unheard and the other feels overwhelmed, communication collapses. Meghan confronted Harry again. Not about the past, about the future. She asked him directly what he was prepared to lose. Public support? Professional partnerships? Control over the story? Harry surprised her with his answer. Everything. He said he was prepared to lose everything if it meant peace. That answer stunned her, because it revealed just how far apart they truly were. Meghan wasn't afraid of loss. She was afraid of erasure. And Harry was willing to accept erasure if it meant escape. Those two positions cannot coexist. And in that moment, Meghan realized something chilling. Harry wasn't bluffing. He wasn't negotiating. He was detaching. And once detachment sets in, no emotional argument can reverse it. That's when Meghan made a decision of her own. Not public, not announced, but deeply consequential. She would no longer rely on Harry's willingness to engage. She would begin preparing for life without his cooperation. And that preparation would involve people, conversations, and strategies Harry never expected. Because the next phase of this story wouldn't be about saving a marriage. It would be about survival after. And the first move in that phase would catch Harry completely off guard. Because it wouldn't come from the press. It wouldn't come from advisors. It would come from Meghan herself. And once she made it, there would be no going back. What if the most consequential decision wasn't loud, emotional, or public? What if it happened quietly, in a moment of clarity so sharp it felt almost cruel? Because that's how people close to Meghan describe what came next. Not a meltdown, not a leak. A pivot. The kind that only happens when someone realizes the ground beneath them is no longer stable. And waiting will only make the fall worse. Meghan didn't announce her decision to anyone. Not to Harry. Not to advisors. Not even to the people she trusted most. She internalized it. And that made it dangerous. Because once someone stops seeking reassurance and starts preparing outcomes, the entire dynamic shifts. Up until now, Meghan had been reacting to Harry's distance, reacting to advisor pressure, reacting to the growing sense that time was no longer on her side. But this moment was different. This moment was about control. Not control over Harry, control over survival. According to insiders, the realization came during a pause, one of those stretches of silence where nothing is said, but everything is understood. Harry had declined another attempt at a long conversation, not dismissively, gently. He said he didn't have the emotional bandwidth. That phrase landed hard, because emotional bandwidth implies limits, and limits imply permanence. Meghan understood then that she could no longer depend on Harry to shape the next chapter, whether that chapter included her or not. So she stopped waiting. The first thing she did wasn't dramatic. It was practical. She began gathering information. Not digging for dirt, not plotting revenge. Information. What protections existed? What leverage did she realistically have? What outcomes were survivable and which weren't? People close to her say this was the moment her energy changed completely. She became focused, organized, strategic in a way that felt almost unsettling to those who noticed it. Because emotional volatility had been replaced by precision. And precision is far more powerful. The next move was subtle but significant. Meghan requested a private consultation, not with a lawyer, not yet, but with someone experienced in crisis positioning, someone who understood public narratives, reputational risk, and long-term optics. Not to go public, to prepare. That distinction matters. Preparation doesn't mean action. It means readiness, and readiness gives confidence. According to sources, this consultation reframed everything for Meghan. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't cornered. She had options. But those options came with trade-offs. Visibility versus restraint. Timing versus momentum. Sympathy versus credibility. The message was clear. If this ended quietly, Harry would likely emerge unscathed. If it ended publicly, Meghan could shape perception, but only once. There would be no second first impression. That's when Meghan began to understand the real stakes. Not just emotional loss, narrative loss. Because once Harry disengaged fully, his silence would speak louder than anything she could say. And silence is often interpreted as strength. That terrified her. Because Meghan had never thrived in silence. She thrived in articulation, in telling her story, in framing experience through language and meaning. And now, the person she had relied on to amplify that story was withdrawing entirely. The consultant advised patience, not inactivity, patience. Observe behavior, document interactions, avoid emotional outbursts that could be misinterpreted. Essentially, become the calm one. That advice cut against every instinct Meghan had, but she listened. And that's when the power shift began, because while Harry continued to retreat emotionally, Meghan stopped chasing. She became distant in a different way, not cold, measured. Harry noticed it almost immediately. The texts slowed, the questions stopped, the urgency vanished. At first he felt relief, space at last, but relief quickly turned into unease. Because when someone stops fighting for you, it doesn't always mean they've given up. Sometimes it means they're planning, and Harry sensed the change. He asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. That answer unnerved him, because fine, in this context, didn't mean peace. It meant control regained. This is where the emotional chess game truly began. Meghan stopped pressing for answers, stopped seeking reassurance, stopped asking where things were going. Instead, she started making independent decisions. Scheduling, commitments, plans that didn't involve Harry, not as punishment, as preparation. And that independence sent a message, one Harry hadn't expected. She wasn't waiting anymore. People close to Harry say this triggered something unexpected. Guilt. Not because he wanted to return, but because he realized Meghan was capable of moving forward without him. And that possibility destabilized his sense of moral clarity. It's one thing to leave someone who is visibly dependent. It's another to leave someone who is quietly recalibrating. Harry began checking in more. Casual questions, neutral tone. But Meghan didn't engage the way she used to. She kept things surface level. And that restraint frustrated him, because suddenly he wasn't the only one setting boundaries. The next move came when Meghan requested a mediated discussion. Not emotional, structured, with ground rules. That request alone was a shock. It signaled seriousness, not reconciliation. Resolution, Harry agreed, partly out of obligation, partly out of curiosity. He wanted to know what she was thinking. The meeting was calm, too calm. No raised voices, no accusations, just clarity. Meghan spoke first. She acknowledged the breakdown. She acknowledged his exhaustion. She acknowledged that forcing reconciliation would only breed resentment. That admission caught Harry off guard. He had expected resistance. Instead, he got acceptance. But acceptance with conditions. Meghan outlined what she needed moving forward. Not demands, boundaries, privacy around certain matters, coordination on timing, respect in public posture. In exchange, she offered something Harry hadn't considered: restraint. No public airing of grievances, no emotional escalation, no reactive narratives, but only if those boundaries were honored. Harry listened carefully, because for the first time since this began, Meghan wasn't pleading. She was negotiating, and negotiation implies parity. This conversation marked a turning point, not because it healed anything, but because it reset the balance of power. Meghan was no longer the one chasing closure. She was defining terms. Harry agreed to most of it, relieved perhaps that the situation wasn't spiraling publicly. But he underestimated one thing. Meghan wasn't just negotiating for the present. She was positioning for the future. According to insiders, she left that meeting with clarity. If Harry honored the agreement, she would maintain restraint. If he didn't, she was prepared to act independently. And that preparation had already begun. What Harry didn't know was that Meghan had also begun rebuilding connections. Not romantic, professional, strategic. People she hadn't leaned on in years. People who understood influence. And how quickly narratives can shift. These weren't leaks, they were conversations. Quiet ones, the kind that plant seeds. And seeds don't make noise when they're planted, only when they grow. Harry sensed something was happening, not explicitly, but intuitively. He asked again if she was okay. She smiled. She said she was focused. That answer unsettled him more than anger had. Because focus suggests direction, and direction suggests movement away. This chapter of the story is often misunderstood. People assume power shifts happen when someone speaks out, but often they happen when someone stops reacting. Meghan had stopped reacting. She was choosing her next step deliberately. And that step would involve stepping out of the emotional frame entirely into something far colder, far more controlled. The next phase wouldn't be about heartbreak. It would be about positioning, about who appeared stable, who appeared composed, who appeared wronged, and who appeared free. Harry believed silence would protect him. Meghan was beginning to understand that silence could be interpreted and sometimes exploited. And the first real test of their fragile agreement was coming, because pressure from the outside world was building. Media inquiries were increasing, speculation was intensifying, and someone, somewhere, was about to force a narrative shift neither of them had planned for. When that happened, Meghan would have to decide whether to maintain restraint or deploy the strategy she had quietly been preparing. And Harry would realize too late that control isn't lost in a single moment. It's lost when you assume the other person isn't capable of moving without you. What happens when doing everything right still isn't enough? Because that's the moment this story entered a new phase, one neither Harry nor Meghan could control anymore. The pressure didn't arrive as a headline. It arrived as a pattern. A journalist asking the same question twice, a producer circling back off the record, a friend of a friend casually mentioning they'd heard something vague but troubling. Individually, nothing alarming. Collectively, unmistakable. Silence was no longer neutral. Silence was becoming suspicious. This is the part of public life no one prepares you for. You can keep quiet, you can coordinate, you can do everything advisors recommend. But once enough people sense there's a story, the vacuum fills itself. And the version that fills it rarely favors nuance. Harry noticed first, not because he was monitoring the media, he was actively avoiding it, but because people around him started changing their tone. Conversations became careful. Questions became indirect. Friends who used to joke stopped joking. That shift is subtle, but unmistakable. It's the moment when others know something you haven't acknowledged out loud yet. Meghan noticed it too, but her reaction was different. Where Harry felt discomfort, Meghan felt urgency, because she understood something instinctively. If the silence cracked without preparation, she would lose control of the frame. And she wasn't willing to let that happen. The first real sign of trouble came through an intermediary. A trusted contact reached out to Meghan with a warning. Nothing confirmed. Nothing printable, but enough to set off alarms. Someone was talking, not a close insider, not a principal, but someone adjacent enough to observe changes, schedules shifting, separate movements, unusual patterns. The worst kind of source, the kind that gets details wrong but tone right. And tone is what drives speculation. The message was simple. Be ready. Meghan didn't panic. She didn't react emotionally. She did something far more dangerous. She activated the plan she had quietly prepared, not publicly, privately. She reached out to the crisis consultant again. This time, not for theory, for timing. The consultant's assessment was blunt. You're approaching the point where you either shape the narrative or inherit one. There is no third option. That assessment forced a hard choice. Stick to the agreement with Harry and hope the silence holds, or begin positioning subtly in ways that could not be traced back as aggressive but would shift perception if needed. Meghan asked one question. If I do nothing, who benefits? The answer was immediate. Harry. Silence always benefits the one who wants to disappear. It rarely benefits the one who will remain visible. That realization didn't make Meghan angry, it made her decisive. The next step was quiet. She didn't issue statements. She didn't leak details. She didn't even talk about Harry directly. Instead, she focused on presence, appearances, controlled visibility, moments designed to convey stability, composure, and independence without explanation. A carefully timed engagement. A public appearance where she looked calm, focused, and unbothered. No theatrics, no emotional cues. Just steadiness. That move was deliberate, because in the absence of information, people read behavior. And Meghan wanted her behavior to say one thing, I'm fine. Harry noticed immediately, not because he was monitoring her movements, but because others mentioned it, casually. Have you seen Meghan lately? She seems Steady. That word lingered. Steady. It implied something Harry hadn't considered, that the public might not see him as the calm one after all. This unsettled him, because his entire strategy relied on disengagement being interpreted as maturity. But disengagement only works if the other person appears unstable. And Meghan wasn't playing that role anymore. The pressure intensified. Media inquiries grew sharper, not accusatory, leading. Are you and Harry still aligned on upcoming plans? Is everything okay behind the scenes? Should we expect changes? Harry refused to engage. Meghan deflected gracefully. But deflection has a shelf life. Eventually, it invites interpretation. And interpretation can harden into narrative faster than anyone expects. The first speculative piece didn't break anything new. It didn't accuse, it didn't claim inside knowledge. It simply asked the question everyone was whispering. Are they drifting apart? That's all it took. Because once the question is asked publicly, it never goes away. Harry was furious. Not at Meghan, at the situation. At the inevitability of it all. He felt exposed, dragged back into a public conversation he desperately wanted to avoid. He called Meghan, not angrily, urgently. We need to shut this down. Meghan listened, and for the first time she didn't immediately agree. She asked him what he meant. A denial? A statement? A coordinated appearance? Harry hesitated, because shutting it down required engagement. And engagement was exactly what he didn't want. That hesitation told Meghan everything she needed to know. Harry wanted silence, but he also wanted protection. And those two things were no longer compatible. Meghan pointed this out gently. If we don't say anything, others will. If we deny, we commit to something we may not be able to sustain. If we appear together, we create expectations neither of us can meet. Harry had no answer, because there was no perfect move anymore. This is where the fragile agreement began to strain. Harry asked Meghan to trust him, to wait, to let it pass. Meghan asked him to trust her, to prepare. They were asking for opposite things. Waiting benefits the person who is leaving. Preparation benefits the person who stays. That tension is irreconcilable. The next escalation didn't come from the press. It came from within Harry's circle. A friend, well-meaning but blunt, told him something that shook him. You don't get to disappear and expect the story to disappear with you. Harry resisted that idea. He believed his silence would speak for itself, but silence doesn't speak. It invites projection, and the projections were beginning to tilt in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Some commentators framed his withdrawal as cold, as evasive, as abandonment, not universally, but enough to matter. That scared him. Because Harry had never wanted to be seen as the one who walked away. He wanted this to be quiet, respectful, unremarkable. But unremarkable was no longer on the table. Meghan sensed the shift too. She noticed that some commentary was beginning to frame her as resilient, composed, even sympathetic, not because she had said anything, but because she hadn't fallen apart. That framing gave her leverage, and leverage changes calculus. For the first time, Meghan realized she didn't have to rush. The narrative wasn't turning against her. It was waiting for clarity, waiting for someone to move. Harry felt that waiting as pressure. He began urging resolution, not reconciliation, resolution. Let's decide something. Let's finalize a direction. Let's stop living in limbo, Meghan agreed. But on one condition, that whatever decision was made, it would be handled jointly. No disappearing acts, no unilateral silence, no framing that left her exposed. Harry struggled with this, because joint handling meant visibility, and visibility was exactly what he was trying to escape. This is where resentment began creeping in, quietly, subtly. Harry began feeling trapped again, not by the institution he had fled, but by the very dynamics he thought he had escaped. And Meghan began feeling something else. Empowered. Not vindictive, empowered. Because she realized that Harry needed cooperation as much as she did. And cooperation meant negotiation. The next move came when a major outlet requested comment. Not speculation, not rumor, confirmation. That request changed everything. Because once a major outlet asks, the clock starts ticking. You can't ignore it indefinitely. Harry wanted to decline. Meghan wanted to respond carefully. The advisor intervened. If you say nothing, this becomes a story about avoidance. If you deny, this becomes a story about deception. If you acknowledge change without detail, you buy time. That third option was risky. But it was the only one that preserved some control. Harry reluctantly agreed. A carefully worded acknowledgement was drafted. Nothing final. Nothing emotional, just an admission that things were evolving privately. But even that felt like defeat to Harry, because it meant surrendering his last illusion that he could exit quietly. Meghan saw it differently. She saw it as containment, as dignity, as protecting herself from being written out of her own story. They argued. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with fatigue. The kind of argument that comes when both people are depleted but still locked in opposing needs. Eventually, Harry relented. The statement was released, measured, neutral, ambiguous. And within minutes, it was everywhere. Analysis, speculation, interpretation. The silence had officially ended. Harry felt exposed. Meghan felt braced, and both of them understood in that moment that the story no longer belonged to them alone. Something irreversible had happened. The marriage was now a public question mark. And public question marks demand answers. The pressure would only intensify from here. Because once the public senses an ending, it doesn't wait patiently. It hunts for reasons, for villains, for victims. And the next phase of this story would force Harry and Meghan into positions neither of them had wanted to occupy, positions that would test loyalty, restraint, and resolve in ways far more brutal than silence ever could. Because now, the world was watching, and it was hungry. What happens when the public stops asking what's happening and starts deciding why? Because that's the moment this situation crossed from uncertainty into judgment. The acknowledgement didn't calm anything. It accelerated it. Within hours of that carefully worded statement going live, the tone shifted. Analysts stopped speculating about whether something was wrong and started dissecting what kind of wrong it was. Friends picked sides quietly. Commentators framed timelines. Every past moment was reinterpreted through a new lens. And the most dangerous thing of all, the story began to feel familiar. Familiar stories don't wait for facts. They snap into patterns. The distant husband, the composed wife, the quiet exit, the resilient presence. Harry felt that snap immediately, not because of what was written, but because of what wasn't. His silence was no longer being read as restraint. It was being read as avoidance. And that terrified him, because Harry had spent years fighting to control how he was perceived. Not as a royal, not as a symbol, as a person. And now, the very thing he believed would protect him was turning into the sharpest accusation. Why isn't he speaking? Why isn't he standing beside her? Why does she look like she's carrying this alone? Those questions multiplied. Meghan saw them too. And this is where the emotional complexity deepened. She didn't celebrate the shift. She didn't weaponize it. She simply allowed it to exist. And allowing a narrative to exist can be more powerful than feeding it. According to people close to her, Meghan was hyper-aware of every appearance, every expression, every interaction. Not because she was performing, but because she understood the stakes had changed. This was no longer about convincing Harry of anything. It was about ensuring she wasn't erased. An erasure doesn't happen in a single headline. It happens gradually, through omission. Harry tried to push back internally. He told himself this was temporary. That public attention would fade, that the lack of concrete detail would protect everyone. But the opposite happened. The less detail there was, the more space there was for interpretation. And interpretation tends to favor whoever looks present. Meghan was present. Harry was not. That imbalance began to define the narrative. Friends reached out to Harry, not to scold, but to check in. And those check-ins carried an undertone he hadn't anticipated. Concern. Are you okay? You seem distant. This looks hard. Concern implies vulnerability. And vulnerability, when paired with silence, can morph into perceived guilt. Harry hated that. He didn't feel guilty for wanting peace. But he could feel the story drifting in a direction he hadn't chosen. Meghan, meanwhile, was dealing with a different pressure. Support, messages, outreach, public warmth. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was unmistakable. And support creates expectation. People expect you to hold your ground. to speak eventually, to explain. And Meghan felt that pull intensely, not because she wanted to explain, but because silence for her had always been interpreted differently. Silence from Harry read as stoic. Silence from Meghan risked being read as calculated. The double standard wasn't new, but it was sharper now, the crisis consultant warned her. The longer you remain visible without comment, the more people will project strength onto you. That can be good, until it isn't. Because once you're seen as strong, people stop offering grace. They expect clarity. They expect leadership. They expect you to set the tone. Meghan understood that, but she was also keenly aware of the agreement she had made. No unilateral moves, no emotional escalation. She had honored it so far. Harry, however, was beginning to feel boxed in by it. The public was reacting. The media was circling. And he felt he was losing control without even participating. He asked his advisor whether breaking silence might help. The answer was not reassuring. Speaking now would invite scrutiny. Staying silent invites interpretation. There is no move that resets this cleanly. That reality hit hard, because Harry realized something unsettling. He wasn't being dragged into a story, he was already in it. The question was whether he wanted to shape it, or remain a shadow within it. Meghan sensed his discomfort. She could hear it in his voice during brief check-ins, the hesitations, the frustration, the sense that he was being misunderstood. And for a moment, she felt something unexpected, sympathy, because she knew that feeling well. Being misunderstood publicly is isolating, and isolation can make people